but it wouldn't be nothing, nothing without a woman or a girl.
Honey, I'm home.
Hi there. I just finished cleaning.
Where's the goddamn food?
I'm nearly finished. Yeah.
And I want to drink right now. And get that ass over here, quick.
I'm sorry, sir.
How you doing, son? What is this? I don't want a beer. I want goddamn whiskey.
Yeah, okay.
And it better be fucking Jack Daniels.
I'm sorry, sir.
That's not Jack Daniels. What is this?
How would you feel about getting married in grade 10 and spending the rest of your life with your husband and your family, not having any other expectations?
Those who think that the women's liberation movement is a joke, may I disabuse you of that notion. It is about equal opportunity. We are really talking about humanism.
The time had just come when I had been pushed as far as I could stand to be pushed. I would have to know once and for all what rights I had as a human being.
Women of colour faced all the restrictions and limitations of white women and all the restrictions and limitations of women of colour. They meant practically nothing to society. What did change was the pill being approved by the FDA in 1960, the contraceptive pill, which was very radical at the time and meant that sex need not lead to pregnancy. The pill was also an equaliser, a liberator, and very easy to take. Women had equal sexual power to men. Critics, however, did warn that the pill would spawn a generation of loose and immoral women. What do you think the approval of the pill spawned in the next generation of women like your mother?
The significance was that it saved women and children's lives because abortion was the need for abortion was decreased in large numbers. It also lifted families out of poverty, and it increased the good health and well-being of all individuals, families and their communities.
Before the 60s, the norm of women was very different. Women were meant to be housewives only. They were taught in special schools to do the housekeeping and care for their husbands.
Just about an hour ago, I got you fired.
What? What did you do that for?
I figured that being my wife would take up all of your time.
Women were often seen as a kind of property, and their personality was also changed to fit their husband. If women would be smarter than the husbands, they would be seen as a threat to the husband's manliness, and therefore Therefore, they were most of the time not able to get a normal education.
How would people react now when a woman or a girl is going to study, and how is this different from during the 1950s and 1960s?
The aims of the women's rights movements were to achieve the Equal Rights Amendment, which means that there is no legal discrimination on sex, the Equal Pay Act, so women get paid equally, and also the addition of sex discrimination to the Civil Rights Act and other laws that would guarantee equality for women.
We've got all the cooperating groups and organizations that are in the coalition here in Dade County and throughout the state writing letters like mad. They're talking to their legislators at home. They're going to be going up to Tallahassee and speaking to their legislators there. And we've just made a great concerted effort. We feel Florida has got to pass the ERA this year.
By achieving these things, men and women would be equal by the law, which is one type of equality, as they would have the same basic rights as men. They also aim to bring equality to women in education, giving them access to all educational programs and subjects, such as science and math, but also sport programs and others that wouldn't be suitable for a woman before. They also aim to encourage and convince young women to start a career instead of becoming housewives. By making these changes in society, the women's rights movement hoped to give the woman a chance to change equal images, roles and opportunities as men.
That is the plan.
The feminist movement of the 1960s and 1970s was mainly focused on the workplace and the work for women, because it was known that women only earned 70% of the salary that men earned. So this was very unequal. They also wanted to have the access to better jobs.
Betty Friedan's generation sought not to dismantle the prevailing system, but to open it up for women's participation on public and political level. However, the more radical women's liberation movement was determined to completely overthrow the patriarchy that they believed was oppressing every aspect of women's lives, including their private lives. They had popularized the idea that the personal is political, that women's political inequality had equally important personal ramifications encompassing their relationships, sexuality, birth control, and abortion, clothing and body image, and roles in marriage, housework, and childcare. As such, the different wings of the feminist movement sought women's equality on both a political and personal level.
If you were to reboot the women's rights movement in 2016, what would your aims be?
Simone de Beauvoir was a French feminist who was globally very important to the women's rights movement universally. Simone de Beauvoir wrote a book called Second Sex, which really inspired Betty Friedan and supported her ideals. Betty Friedan was a journalist and reporter in New York, and she wrote the famous book Feministique, which we have used many extracts from. In Betty Friedan's book, she mainly wanted to discuss the importance and expectations in women's lives and how she often felt useless. Betty Friedan wanted to discuss the problem because there were men in American society in 1960 that would say things as followed. Hell yes, we have a quota. We do keep women out when we can. We don't want them there, and they don't want them elsewhere, either, whether or not they'll admit it. This was said by an American man in 1960. Her work had such an impact that it credited with creating the second wave feminism of the American women's rights movement. She was a key leader of the NOW organization, which was the National Organization for Women, founded in 1966. She mainly fought for abortion rights in 1969 and childcare centres which would give women the opportunity to work and women to work for themselves.
Gloria Steinem was another important woman and feminist of America. She was a social activist, writer, editor, and also a lecturer. She joined Friedan and Osborg in the NOW organization, and as a feminist she created one of the first magazines ever in America for women, called The Miss. This name also showed independence of women, because it only was about women, for women, and it said in the name a woman that wasn't married. She was also with this magazine, she did attract a lot of press. She was also known because she had won the fight with breast cancer.
The Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, was a constitutional amendment for the improvement of women's rights. It did pass the Congress in 1972 and was accepted by 30 states by the end of the following year. However, it failed because it was unable to gain the additional 8 acceptations necessary by the 1982 deadline.
Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex.
At first there was a widespread public support for the ERA, because it was something new and something constitutional, which would show to the rest of the world that America was a civilized country. However, in practice, the public was still very conservative with the traditional men and women roles in households. Therefore, and because of the women and the feminist community had already achieved a lot, people thought that they were like going to take too many rights for men. This would also, and people also thought that this era would indirectly approve the gay rights and abortion rights, which people were back then still definitely against too.
Liberal feminism promoted liberation and addressed the inequality between men and women through political tact and diplomacy. When it quickly became clear that the newly established Equal Employment Opportunity Commission would not enforce the law's protection of women as workers, a group of feminists, including Betty Friedan, founded the organisation we have referred to earlier, NOW, or National Organisation for Women, in 1966.
Almost on nothing did we disagree. We all knew what had to be done. The thing is, though, that everybody in NOW had something different that made her mad. For me, it was that women were kept out of restaurants and private clubs where business was done.
This organisation lobbied Congress for pro-equality laws and assisted women seeking legal aid as they battled workplace discrimination in the courts. NOW was a powerful political arm of liberal feminists. They now organise meetings and discussions for women to discuss the issues they faced on a daily basis. Now supported consciousness raising, which was a way to relate the problems of women in their daily lives, their personal lives, to a national issue. Now promoted social equality with men and lobbied for congressional legislation, including the prohibition of sexual discrimination as well as national equal rights. The organisation was also involved in campaigning towards the Equal Rights Amendment.
Radical feminism is a more revolutionary and militant way of achieving the women's liberation. Feminists such as Shula Smith Firestone and Judith Brown supported this. They also believed that men and the institutions created by men had oppressed all and every aspect of women. Radical feminists called for a complete revolution and therefore a complete turnover of the hierarchy so that women will be above men. An element of this radical group were the Red Stockings, and this was a group that went onto a champion and spread the knowledge of the vital women's rights movement and liberation theory into New York. The New York radical women also organized the Miss America protest. Here 400 feminists came to visit, and here they threw typical objects for women into the so-called freedom trash can to show that they were independent and didn't need a man.
Women to re-examine traditional roles and to protest old stereotypes. During the Miss America pageant in 1968, women conducted demonstrations on the boardwalk in Atlantic City. Demanding freedom from the bondage of male chauvinism, many women began to seek professional careers.
Robin Morgan, which was the organizer, also wrote that the group was protesting against the pageant's promotion of the beauty standards that we ourselves are conditioned to take seriously. As the pageant was taking place, feminists marched around the Freedom Trash Can, and this event is also highly associated with the bra burning. While with the bra burning, there was never any fire used. until 1979.
Both these two types of feminism were extremely important for the women's liberation movement in the 1960s, where liberal feminism in the Now organization used more political methods to improve women's rights by campaigning for the Equal Rights Amendment, for example, but radical feminism took direct action.
Another extremely prominent organization in the women's rights movement was the League of Women. The League of Women was formed slightly earlier than the other two organizations in 1920, just before the Women's Suffrage Act. The League began as a mighty political experiment designed to help 20 million women carry out their new responsibilities as voters. It encouraged them to use their new power to participate in shaping public policy.
Mainly what I do is try to get the word out. Your voice is your vote. Your vote is your voice.
The message that we try to bring home is that democracy only works if you participate.
Feminists with roots in the labour movement launched local groups to organise women workers, improve their working conditions and fight for the equal rights on the job. Black feminists targeted such issues as childcare, police repression, welfare and healthcare, and founded the National Black Feminist Organisation in 1973.
If the third wave of the women's rights movement would be here today, would you prefer to have the more radical or more political way of action? France was one of the most revolutionary nations in the women's rights movement, and Germany quickly followed after the women's rights movement in America and was in full action by the end of the 1980s.
The French, together with Finland and Norway, were one of the first countries to grant women suffrage at the beginning of the 20th century. The Latin American countries all granted women suffrage in the period of 1934 to 1950. In the Philippines, women have voted since 1937, in Japan since 1945, in mainland China since 1947, and in the former Soviet Union since 1917. Women have been enfranchised in most of the countries of the Middle East where men can vote, with the exception of Saudi Arabia. All the suffrage acts and the right for women to vote did not mean that they were being treated equally worldwide, but it was a major step in the global women's rights and gives women a political and educational power. What countries today are you aware of that still see women as second-class citizens? Well, we can still realise that even today, the effects of the women's rights movement globally is not taking effect everywhere. If we look at the Middle East, if we look at Asia, if we look at Africa, women are still demoralised on a daily basis. Rape crises in Africa, Middle East, there's also a rape crisis. It's a norm to be objectifying women.
The women's rights movement opened many doors to American women and gave them a more significant role within the society. The movement hired the expectations of women's abilities. By the early 20th centuries, women were allowed to attend college and seek a career, but definitely not in the large numbers like men were able to. The women's rights movement also initiated a bunch of powerful organizations such as the Now, League of Women, and many more. Additionally, women's economic role in society changed. They also did earn a salary, which did increase a little bit over time. It was definitely not as much as men did, but there was improvement made. The women's rights movement also gave women more insight into politics and how they could receive a stronger political role.
Which is an extreme weakness of the women's rights movement. Women still do not feel comfortable in such situations. It's a man's job. The demoralization of women in politics is still very strong in society in America today, even to the extent where public figures can influence society. public figures that might even become president of the USA.
I moved on her like a bitch. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
Whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy.
The gains of the women's rights movement in America were women's equal access to education, their increased participation in politics and the workplace, their access to abortion and birth control, the existence of resources to aid domestic violence and rape victims, and the legal protection of women's rights. These are often taken for granted. And still today, women, feminists and many women strive for increased equality.
And the more I've spoken about feminism, the more I have realised that fighting for women's rights has too often become synonymous with man-hating. If there is one thing I know for certain, it is that this has to stop.
Human rights are women's rights, and women's rights are human rights once and for all.
We close our presentation with a quote from Betty Friedan, as we opened with a quote from Betty Friedan.
This is a man's world, but it wouldn't be nothing without a woman or a girl.